One of the things about commercial artists in Cleveland is that they were pretty well paid, and a common practice for them was to work for a year or two at a place like Otis Lithograph, and then they would go to Paris or Munich to study. And because of that, you have a constant movement of artists back and forth between the major European and American art centers and Cleveland. Cleveland was the first place outside New York to have a major group of adventurous modern artists. I might sort of put in a footnote there. Regional American art has been less well studied than it should be, but it seems as though Cleveland was in advance of other places in that period.
So essentially what Henry is saying is that there is a Cleveland School. All of these factors led up to what we now call the Cleveland School. So maybe, Bill, you can jump in and tell us what the Cleveland School is. Is there a Cleveland School? What does it mean? We see a diverse array of paintings around us. How could it all be the Cleveland School?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you, when I first started researching the topic, I really hated the phrase the Cleveland School. And I wondered, is there such a thing? Because school implies something, and some things I don't like. It applies a kind of commonality when there's actually great diversity. It even sounds slightly academic. And so I go back and forth about whether there is a Cleveland School. I think maybe there is, but if there is, it's bigger than Cleveland. Because Cleveland was such a dynamo, it affected everything that was happening in Northeast Ohio. I mean, it was the center, and people were coming here. You know, Schreckengost, came from the east, and Birchfield, of course, also. Clarence Carter came from Portsmouth. It was really a place that sucked in talent. And for all the reasons that Henry said, is that it was economically incredibly dynamic. The fastest growing city in America during the late 19th century, and then the 5th largest and the 6th largest. And it was just this incredibly dynamic place to be. And a lot of artists came here, and it happened much earlier than I realized. And in researching this, you find that there are these really important people in the 19th century, like Alan Smith. There's this fantastic painting that we borrowed from Alexxa that's about a young mechanic, and he's doing his work, and it ties into Cleveland as a transportation center, as a shipping place. And it's really too bad that painting's not here. In fact, in my fantasies, I would make a trade with Alexxa. That painting ought to be in our museum. It's such an icon of Cleveland. But there are many, many, many other really important 19th century artists who were working in the city. And then you had this incredible burst of activity that happened in the early 20th century. And to me, what's so fascinating is the intersection with what was happening in America, because that was the period of great immigration. So you have people coming here from around the world. And a lot of the artists who developed were either immigrants or more likely the sons and daughters of immigrants. So people like August Bealey and Keller and all these people, they retained a lot of culture. They were fluent in German. They read German literature. They read Nietzsche. They were very interested in European ideas. There were tons of papers in different languages in Cleveland, and they were drawn back to Europe. So they would, Bealey, as Henry mentioned, saw the first Blau-Reiter exhibition in Munich. But others, were traveling abroad and bringing these ideas back to Cleveland. And there was a real burst of cultural activity in Cleveland, very much on the cutting edge in many places. And it's different than what's happening in other cities. I mean, Cleveland really did have a unique identity. And you see it around here. And I remember there was a painting on the wall on the other side of the room that at first I thought it was maybe Summer, and then I realized it's William Eastman. And I'm telling you, there are a lot of artists who were sharing a kind of common understanding of modernism, using fauve color and compositional ideas. And I guess I will grudgingly accept the word Cleveland School now. but it doesn't mean they're all alike, because it's very different. And you have these people experimenting with avant-garde abstraction like William Sommer, and then other people doing incredibly great American scene realism. There's a fantastic Gertner over there, for example. There are a couple of them that really, to me, are at the top of the, of what was being produced with respect to showing American culture and American life. And then the larger question for me, and maybe we'll get into this later, is how long did that last? And is there a distinctive feeling or a distinctive way of approaching art that continues much, much later? And I've wondered about that, and I also wonder if maybe we just don't have enough perspective to see it. And I think it may be there, and that other generations will see it in a different light.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and maybe, Dennis, you can speak to this about kind of the uniqueness of art happening in Cleveland. You lived in a lot of other cities and have worked in a lot of other cities in the arts realm, and I know you have some ideas about that.
Well, it's interesting. My first real job was for the Archives of American Art, which is part of the Smithsonian, and I was the Midwest director. Now, we had a Boston office, a New York office, a Washington office, and a Los Angeles office that covered those specific cities. I covered Pittsburgh to Denver. And I think it was I think it wasn't just financial. I think it was attitudinal about what was really going on in the heartland of, especially being now in the perspective, this is the 1970s and 80s, of that perspective, it was all going on in New York, a little of it was going on in Los Angeles, and nothing else was of value anywhere else. And there was a sort of rediscovery that we're talking about that's really kind of important. Suddenly you see a person like William Sommer, and you think, oh my God, this is like a national figure, kind of not celebrated anywhere beyond, Brandywine, Ohio, and Cleveland. But I don't think it went that far out of our own region. Maybe you feel different about that, but we can talk about it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the curious question, the question is why? I agree with you about Sommer. Some of his work is spectacular. It's just spectacular. It's as good, if it's not better, than anything that was being done in a modernist style in America. So there is this curious question about the sort of the lack of appreciation for some of these artists, and I've never truly understood it. The thing that I have learned is that this is a really big country, and it's very complex. And there are certain places that tend to get media and other types of coverage, and others that don't. And that's perhaps the one explanation that I can give for it, but it's not a good explanation at all. It's just very hard to understand. Things that I've learned as a museum curator is that art history is very artificial. And what you see in museums is, to a degree too. I mean, I'm always discovering great artists who aren't that well known and who don't have the kind of presence that other people do.
It's really exciting also to see the legacy of Cleveland art from that era still alive in some of our institutions, like CMA, like CIA, who can really tell that full story. And hopefully, I don't know, maybe with some more attention from contemporary exhibitions like Front, we can really delve into the history and shine a light on the history here too.
So like William Sommer and Bealey, they weren't connected to the school, and they were working in commercial industries. And Henry has made this fantastic point about how important Cleveland was as a center for printing and publishing, and that's where those people were working. And for them, what you would call their independent art was their outlet. So they were reacting against. But it's always been fascinating to me that you have these people who were working in commercial industries, and they were reacting against that with the kind of private, avant-garde, more experimental work that they were producing.
Well, I might start off by saying that I came to Cleveland from Kansas City, and Kansas City had one very good artist, Thomas Hart Benton, but then when you started to go below that, there wasn't very much to look at. And I think what's interesting about Cleveland is the extraordinary diversity of artists and the different media they worked with, and also the interplay between industrial design and things like painting. One of the curious things about the Cleveland School of Art is that it starts off with a very strong feminist program. It actually was originally a school for women. It was started by a group of wealthy women on Euclid Avenue. Actually, it's sort of amusing. It was Oscar Wilde came to Cleveland and announced that Cleveland needed an art school, and a few months later, these ladies created an art school. So I don't know if that's cause and effect. But you know, one of the first graduates of the Cleveland School of Art is Clara Driscoll, who was not very well known until recently, but it turns out that she basically designed all of Tiffany's lamps. So she's really an internationally significant figure in the whole development of Art Nouveau. But there's this strong feminist history, and of course this was a period where there were not very many professions that were open to women. I think the other thing about the Cleveland Institute of Art that's interesting is the early focus on industrial design. And Victor Schreckengost in the early 1930s arguably created the first modern program of industrial design in the United States right here in Cleveland. Some of the best work of the Cleveland School, like some of Schreckengost's work, doesn't fit neatly into the usual art history categories. And I think it's been overlooked for that reason.
And then maybe Dennis, then you can talk about forces like the Cocoon Club, where artists were really able to let loose, but also where they were maybe censored in some cases. Dennis has a rich history interacting with censorship in art. He organized a Mapplethorpe exhibition at the Cincinnati that was censored, which was a very famous controversy, and he stood up for the artist, and it was a really important act in the history of art history. We can just talk about how important it is for artists anywhere, and in Cleveland in particular, to have a space where they can really experiment.
Well, I think we know that artists are always ahead of everybody else, okay? They're always known for going into the worst neighborhoods and making them financially viable. They're always trying something new in terms of lifestyle and approach to life. So I thought the Cocoons, when you see the pictures, I don't know, maybe they're up there or not, they're so cute, they're so quaint, you know, and I mean, I know they were daring, I know they were. And I'm sure that for most of Cleveland society, it was, oh my God, right? That you wouldn't be caught dead, or maybe you'd like to go there and not be known that you had gone there. So there's always been that aspect of the art world. I just love the fact that it was so vibrant here. And I'm sure a little nudity or a little risque every now and then closed them down, but they existed for quite a long time.
We have some images of some of the more controversial works in this show that deal with race relations primarily at certain moments in history. So, you know, reaching back to the Cleveland School artists, as Dennis mentioned, were really responding to the issues of their time, as artists today respond to the issues of our time.
I'd like to jump in for a minute, if you
Yeah,
don't mind.
please.
You know, I had a very good time doing transformations because I spent more time than you can imagine reading through the diaries and letters of artists. I read through Birchfield's diaries and Summer, and these artists were very, very, very radical in their political views, much more so than people would realize. I mean, I remember their references to Nietzsche and free love, and I'm talking about Birchfield and people who we think of classic American artists. I'm telling you, things were very avant-garde and very progressive, and they were very much in rebellion against society. And I think that Cleveland was interesting in the way these artists were exploring kind of very advanced progressive ideas.
There's one CIA grad who last year was the subject of censorship, Dana Schutz. I know Mark can talk about that.
So Dana Schutz, she graduated from CIA in 2000 and was discovered by the Saatchi brothers and became very famous. And You may recall a very controversial show a couple of years ago at the American Whitney Museum with the painting called Open Casket, which showed Emmett Till. It was based on the photograph from the early 50s, and it was extremely controversial. And then she followed with this show at the Transformer Station. And I thought that was really gutsy because she doubled down, and the themes were much more political and biblical, and the scale of the work, some of it was very large.
Yeah, and I should say that the reason why this piece was so controversial is because she's a white woman painting the death and the murder of a black boy. So it just drummed up a lot of controversy because of those dynamics. And there's a wonderful essay in the catalog for this show about the female artists of the Cleveland School that everyone should read, because we won't be able to delve deep into that topic tonight.
Yeah. By Marianne Barrie. It's a great piece in your catalog, an essay.
Mm. Yeah.
There are a number of things that came together in the 1930s and 40s. One was the collapse of the Van Swearingen Railroad empire. Van Swearingen's built the Terminal Tower. They developed Shaker Heights and other parts of Cleveland, and they came very close to creating the first transcontinental railroad line in the United States. Unfortunately, the Depression came along. Their empire was heavily leveraged, and in the space of 2 years, their net worth went from $3 billion, which was a lot of money in 1930, to $3,000, which is what they were worth at the time of their death. If the Depression had been timed a little differently, Cleveland would have ended up being the transportation center of the United States, and it might well now be bigger than Chicago. The other thing that happens is technology changes so that companies like Otis Lithograph that had hired a large number of skilled artists shifted to mechanical modes of reproduction, and there's a kind of diaspora of talented Cleveland artists who tend to go first to New York and then to end up in Hollywood. Someone once said that the Renaissance never died, it just moved to Hollywood. And that's the last place perhaps where all these Renaissance skills are very much in demand. I think now we're starting to take a much more interested look at the work of the Cleveland School, and also one of the aspects of that period is that institutions such as the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Cleveland School of Art were created, which have become a kind of content source of cultural vitality for Cleveland.
I think all of that's true. I'm also thinking about the fact that maybe Cleveland artists were very comfortable because we had this great, publishing and other commercial industries here, and they were making a very comfortable living, and they weren't the starving artists that had to go to Paris and meet Gertrude Stein. They could be very happy living and working in Cleveland. I mean, all of those artists, I know their families. They did fairly well. They were traveling on vacations in the summer and painting and having a really good time of it. So maybe their successes, the success of the city is part of that. They were happy being here. And I have to also, as long as we're blaming people, I'm going to blame art historians and critics. Because, we even have trouble today, and it's fairly well known, of getting these art writers to come to Cleveland. They don't want to, they're in New York, and they will say, oh, my editor won't pay for me to make a trip to Cleveland. So that has been a continual problem for the city. I don't know, for years and years and years. I also think that it's too bad there haven't been big shows of Cleveland art touring. One of my greatest disappointments about transformations, and there's a practical reason for it, the practical reason is that we had to do it quickly for the bicentennial, but I wish it had gone to Washington or someplace else. Because I think for some reason, the way we think as human beings is we have to have mental structures to figure things out. So we put things in categories, so we understand fauvism and cubism, and then we see something that's out of place. It doesn't make sense, and we don't quite understand it. I do know from my personal experience that, when we did transformations and you see all of those early 20th century Cleveland things together, you see all this Schreckengoss, then suddenly it makes sense, and suddenly you understand it and you appreciate it. And I think that the world just hasn't been exposed to big exhibitions of Cleveland art. There was one at the Whitney in '37, and the reviews are fabulous. I mean, they declared Cleveland one of the great art centers in the United States. But that is kind of faded from memory, and I think exposure and understanding is part of the problem.
The op-ed work of Stanzik and others, I mean, that was big.
I think that work is fabulous.
So he's referring to the fact that a lot of artists from the op-ed movement, op-ed pioneers, decided to stay in Cleveland and in many cases taught at CAA instead of going to New York or Los Angeles or other art hubs in the US. And there are some great examples upstairs of that movement, of work that came out of that movement. Mm-hmm.
But when people see it, they don't think Cleveland. Mm-hmm. If you see that in New York, that's the last thing you think about. And I think, there has to be an exhibition of these artists who were working together. And I remember seeing some of those shows when I first came here in the 80s. And one of the interesting things to think about is what's going on between them. And that's when I started looking at early 20th century Cleveland art. It was starting with Birchfield, because a lot of people don't think of, if you live in New York, you don't think of Birchfield as a Cleveland artist. He not only went to the Institute, but he studied with Keller, and he traveled with these artists, and you start putting their work side by side, and you see what's going. There's a dialogue. It's like Picasso and Matisse. There's a dialogue going back and forth. So I'd like to see someone explore also what's going on between those op artists. They knew each other. They were talking to each other. There has to be a synergy between them, and I think it's fascinating and not, at least for me, not as well understood as it might be.
So, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so, it's fascinating looking at the early 50s, Richard Anaskevich. Of course, he was on Time Magazine, I think, 1962, as part of the sort of the face of the op art movement.
Now there's a very large recreation of a mural that was just erected or just completed in downtown Cleveland, so everybody should check that out, a mural by Julian Stanzik. It's interesting what you guys are saying about not enough people telling Cleveland's story outside of Cleveland. Since I've been back, I've pitched a lot of stories to my editors in New York about different Cleveland artists, whether historical or contemporary, and they all say what I expected them to say. Wow, we had no idea all this happened in Cleveland. And the response, I think, of everyone here would be, duh, it's been happening here for so long. We just need to do a better job of getting people, or people need to do a better job of coming here and telling our stories, or we need to do a better job of telling the stories outside of Cleveland. But this show and Front and hopefully some other efforts are making headway in that process. What happens when there are great artists in a city like Cleveland, and there are so many great artists, both historical and contemporary, who don't have a dealer on the coasts to promote their work, and it's a big question.
I can say a few words about this because I deal with the art market all the time, and I'll tell you this: the art market is totally irrational. It's there is no logic to it. It's based upon demand, who's got money and what they're willing to spend. That's it. I deal with paintings that have Cezanne and people, they sell for $350 million. And I can tell you the art market has changed enormously over the past 30 years. I don't know if there's a book that talks about the selling of at auction of Rembrandt's great Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. And that painting, there were two bidders for that painting, the Met in Cleveland. And we were like, and we still remain one of the big movers on the art market. But they were the two big ones, and they were bidding. The Met finally outbid the Cleveland, but it sold for several $1 million, and people were just shocked. Like, what are people paying millions of dollars for a work of art for? But things have changed with the rise of billionaires and hedge funds. They're pushing the market now. They're the people who are pushing the market, not museums and not dealers. And it's also true that a lot of auction prices now are being pushed by private people in China, in the Middle East. And the Cezanne that sold for $350 million reportedly went to someone in the Middle East. So I don't know what's going to happen over time, whether that's going to continue, whether it's going to level off, whether other artists will catch up. Maybe the internet will provide exposure for artists who are not as well known. It's hard to say, but I do know that the art market is very overheated at the moment. It's just phenomenal. I don't actually see it going down though, because there is this demand for certain artists and certain works, and you know, if you've got $50 billion, you know, paying $300 million for a Cezanne is just not that irrational. So it's just it really puts the rest of us, especially museums, in a very, very bad place, because we cannot compete with that kind of money. We just can't.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I think interestingly that also opens up opportunities for collectors to look at other work and buy other work and support other underknown, under-recognized artists or movements like the Cleveland School.
That's an excellent point, and I totally agree with that. Because great art will always last, and things will be readjusted and reevaluated. You know, the meaning of the word art has to do with something that's sort of creme de la creme. This is really great. So in any period, a lot of work will be produced which is mediocre or just okay, and there will always be those incredibly exceptional things. And sometimes those things will get lost in history, but they'll re-emerge. I mean, one of the most interesting experiences for me has been to go back and look at the catalogs of the big World's Fair of the 19th century or early 20th century, and they all had these huge art shows. And you'll see, you know, a list of 800 American artists, and most of them are not even known today. But the great ones will rise and they'll be known. And I think that, you know, as a person who loves art, and I think for anyone who's looked at it, you start after a while recognizing quality, what's exceptional, what moves you, what you know, makes you think. And I think there's some great art in this room, and that will last. It may not be worth $8 billion, but the art will last, and it will give people joy, and it will give them experience. I mean, I have some in my own house, and I don't care what it costs. You know, it will be there, and I think it will always be there. So I don't know about values, but I know about the power and the ability of art to change our lives.
I was going to say, yes, here.